our guest speaker for today is Scott Gessler. Scott Gessler is a small businessman and an attorney. He currently practices law at the firm Gessler, where he specializes in policy law, governmental and election law, and business startups. He currently teaches election law at the University of Denver. From 2011 to 2015, Mr. Gessler was Colorado's 37th Secretary of State, where he served as Colorado's Chief Election Officer and had primary responsibility for new business registrations and other licensing matters. Under his leadership, the office was widely recognized as a national model and won numerous national and international awards. Before becoming Secretary of State, Mr. Gessler practiced election law, ran a successful small business, served at the U.S. Department of Justice as a trial attorney, and served as an Army reservist. Mr. Gessler received his undergraduate degree from Yale Law degree from University of Michigan and MBA from Northwestern University. He lives in Denver with his wife Christy, daughter Sophia, and son Eric. So please welcome our guest with a round of applause.
Thank you very much for having me here today. So we're going to talk a little bit about patriotism, and I have to admit, looking at the patriotism description on the Liberty Common website was pretty impressive. It's a pretty darn good description. So I had to think, well, what am I going to add to that? So when we talk about patriotism, I mean, what's sort of the first thing you think of besides the Liberty Common definition? What's the first thing you think of? You may think of some bandaged Revolutionary War soldiers with a drum and fife marching, or the Liberty Bell, or the John Hancock signature on the Declaration of Independence, maybe a parade with some fighter jets going overhead, of course American flags, and maybe Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address. But let's talk a little bit more about the details, a little bit more about the content of what patriotism is. So the first place you go, of course, is the dictionary to look at the definition. And some of the definitions, they help a bit. So for example, American Heritage Dictionary talks about the love of and devotion to one's country. WordNet talks of love of country and the willingness to sacrifice for it. Another definition I found is patriotism is, generally speaking, emotional attachment to a nation which an individual recognizes as their homeland. And this attachment, also known as national feeling or pride, can be viewed in terms of different features relating to one's own nation, such as ethnic, cultural, political, and historical aspects. I got that one off of Wikipedia on the internet, so you know that if you get it off the internet, it's got to be true. And generally, patriotism is distinguished from its less desirable cousin called nationalism. So patriotism is more of a commitment to values as opposed to a commitment to a nation. Probably George Orwell is one of the most famous quotes about patriotism versus nationalism. If you remember George Orwell, he was a British author, wrote 1984, so the anti-totalitarian book, and he wrote this during the middle of World War II. And he said by nationalism, he meant the habit of identifying oneself with a single nation or other unit, placing it beyond good or evil, and recognizing no other duty than that of advancing its interests. By patriotism, he meant devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life, which one believes to be the best in the world, but has no wish to force on other people. So, by its nature, it's defensive, both militarily and culturally. Nationalism, on the other hand, he said, was inseparable from the desire for power. Mark Twain, always known for pithy quotes, probably summed it up better. He called patriotism loyalty to country always, loyalty to government when it deserves it. So that's sort of generalized definitions of patriotism, but they can apply to pretty much any country. So what are we talking about when we talk about American patriotism? Patriotism in this country. Our patriotism, as it were. I think, let me just sort of start with a story. How many people have heard of Nathaniel Hale. So he was an American patriot in the Civil War, in the Revolutionary War. He was recruited by George Washington to be a spy. And he snuck into New York and was captured 2 days later after sneaking in, and was promptly hanged by a tree. But before he died, he said, I only regret that I have but one life to live for my country. And in Nathan Hale, we get a sense of what patriotism looks like. He said, and that quote came from a British officer who witnessed the execution. The next day, during a flag of truce, he described what happened to the American command outside of New York. So again, Nathan Hale, American patriot, said, I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country. And you'll see Nathan Hale, you'll see statues of him. He's on a stamp. You'll see there's a statue at the CIA headquarters, at the Department of Justice, at Yale University, which is where he attended. But I want to focus first on where he said, one life to lose for my country. So what do we mean by country? Well, it sure as heck wasn't the United States, because the United States didn't even exist at that point. This happened in 1776. So the United States didn't even exist. He wasn't talking about Connecticut, which is where he was from. He wasn't talking about New York, which is where he was spying. He wasn't talking about Virginia, that's where George Washington came from. He was talking about his country. So what was that? Well, that was a group of colonists in the colonies that had a common set of beliefs and a common sense of themselves. It was a common culture. And of course, they were united by a common adversary, Britain. And when we talk about patriotism, really the core of it, a lot of time, is the American creed. Now, how many of you have heard of the American creed? Well, you may not have heard of it described that way, but I'm sure you've all heard of it, because the finest expression, probably the pithiest expression, is in the Declaration of Independence, the second paragraph, where Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." You've all heard that, right, at some point? Well, when you think about it, that's an exceptionally radical and unusual formulation for a set of national beliefs. It talks about a couple principles. One is natural human equality, that we are all born equal. And secondly, that our human beings are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Unalienable means they can't be changed. And we get those from our Creator, from God above, from providence. They are not conferred upon us by government. They're not conferred upon us by society. That's the American creed. And it has a couple corollaries to those principles. Governments only derive their powers from the governed. That the task of government is not to give us rights, but to secure these rights. And it's the right of the people to throw off a government and create a new one. So this is really sort of the finest example of that as described. And this has become known as the American creed. It sounds sort of familiar, I hope. Even though this was well over 200 and some years ago. And we've seen this sort of American creed in many manifestations. Lincoln's address at Gettysburg, he talked about how about our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He basically rephrased, I should say, the Declaration of Independence. There's a British guy, a theologian, philosopher, dramatist named G.K. Chesterton. He famously said, "America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed." And I just gave you the creed. But it's actually, when we talk about country, more than just a creed, more than just a set of ideas. It's also a culture. And what is this culture? This culture, and this sometimes sounds provocative, is actually a Puritan, dissenting, Protestant culture. So what do I mean by that? Well, when you look at U.S. history, American history I should say, it was initially settled by the Puritans, settlers from Britain. And they talked about a couple things and some values that will probably sound pretty familiar. One, they had individual conscience. In other words, it was the responsibility for each individual to learn God's truths directly from the Bible. And what that means is they had an emphasis on individualism, on equality. It wasn't handed down, the biblical teachings, and the rights to the freedom of religion and opinion. They also stressed work ethic, responsibility of the individual for his or her own success and failure in life. And with these, they had congregational forms of organization in this dissenting Protestantism. And that was sort of an opposition to hierarchy, sort of these forms that couldn't be changed. And they assumed that similar democratic forms, that these forms that they had in their congregation, should be throughout all of government. So we have this distinct culture in America that derives from Protestant values. It includes the English language, individualism, a religious commitment, a respect for laws. And we sometimes see this, particularly in times of crisis in the United States, where people will reach back to a thoughts of grace and consecration and salvation, moral rectitude, cultural superiority. Sort of a view that Americans, are a people set apart with a providential mission. So that's a very strong missionary impulse. Going back to Chesterton, he said, America is a nation with the soul of a church. Let me give you an example of sort of how that's come through history and things that resonate. So, you may have heard of a guy named John Winthrop. He was one of the early Puritan settlers. He sailed over. He founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He also founded Connecticut. And when he was on the ship traveling here, he described the new settlement they were planning in the New World as a city upon a hill. He said, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people upon us." That's what he said. And he drew that phrase, city upon a hill, from the Bible. Well, we saw John F. Kennedy use the phrase, city upon a hill. Perhaps one of the most famous modern expositors of it was Ronald Reagan. He said, "I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city, built on rocks, stronger than oceans, wind-swept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace, a city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with a will and a heart to get here." That's how I see it, how I saw it, and how I see it still. We saw John Winthrop's phrase, John F. Kennedy used it, Ronald Reagan used it. Bill Clinton talked about America remains the indispensable nation. There are times when America, and only America, can make a difference. George Bush talked about it. Like generations before us, we have a calling from beyond the stars to stand for freedom. This actually finds its resonance in the Puritan values. And Nathan Hale was actually a good example of this. His father was a minister farmer. He attended Yale, and at that time, those universities weren't universities as we think of them today. They were really sort of theological seminaries where people went to learn religious instruction. So when Nathan Hale made his comment, he was imbued with that sort of religious Puritan fervor that still, to a large extent, exists with us today. A sense of American exceptionalism. Why does that exist today? We have this American creed, this set of ideas, and this Puritan culture. Now, I embrace it fully, and I can tell you, I am not a Puritan. I guess very few people in this room would describe themselves as Puritans. So why do we still have it? Well, you've heard of America as the immigrant, we are a nation of immigrants, right? I'm actually going to challenge that a little bit. That's only partially true. I'd say we're actually a settler nation. The people who came over here, these Puritans and their similar allies, they came over here to settle a new country. They left behind, very self-consciously, what they had before, and they wanted to create a new society. So they created this new society, and then they had a lot of kids. Like a lot of kids. So many kids. And so demographically, as a nation, about probably half of our population can draw some or much of our roots from the Puritans, the people who settled. And then we had all these immigrants come over. And what the immigrants did is they assimilated. They accepted these values. And in fact, very often in America, there's a very strong, what we call an assimilationist urge. Teddy Roosevelt, for example, around the turn of the last century, he said we should insist that if the immigrant who comes here in good faith becomes an American and assimilates himself to us, he shall be treated on an exact equality with everyone else, for it is an outrage to discriminate against any such man because of creed or birthplace or origin. And he went on to talk about how immigrants should be assimilated. Let me add two more components. We've talked about the American creed. We've talked about the Puritan heritage, that impulse. Let me talk about two other aspects of patriotism. One is affection for country. And we saw a lot of that in those videos. I don't know who it was who said, the national anthem always sends a chill down his spine. That's a pretty good description. If you look at Lincoln's first inaugural address, he talks about the mystic chords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone. Nathan Hale, he showed love for his country. I only regret I have but one life to lose. That's truly love and affection for a country. The other component is service to your country. In part, that's why I think sometimes patriotism is so bound up with images of the military. Not because we celebrate military breaking things and killing people, which sometimes militaries do, but we look at it as a form of service and sacrifice. Sometimes the ultimate sacrifice. And that's a connection to the civic obligations we have in our country of courage, of sacrifice, and of service. And I think this is why Hale is really considered such a true patriot, his affection and his sacrifice. Because let's face it, Nathan Hale was a terrible spy. He was a rotten spy. He got sent to New York, and in 48 hours, he was captured. He didn't use a different name. He went by Nathan Hale. He was a school teacher, and his disguise was a school teacher. And not only did he go by his name, but he carried around his Yale diploma with him just in case anyone really wanted to know if that was his real name. So he wasn't a great spy, but he was a great patriot for his love of country and his willingness to sacrifice. Let me end on a few notes. So at Liberty Common, this is a little bit unique. There aren't a lot of high schools that have lectures on patriotism. There aren't a lot of schools that have patriotism as one of the foundational principles here. Liberty itself is one of the values in the American creed, hardwired right into the name of Liberty Common. But you will be challenged. And I will tell you here, patriotism today is a very controversial comment, a very controversial thought. In fact, patriotism has always been a controversial thought, in large part because it is so closely connected with that evil cousin of nationalism. And there's always been a fear of patriotism morphing into nationalism. I mean, that was described, for example, by Alexander Hamilton. He was the primary author of the Federalist Papers. That was a public defense of the Constitution to get people to accept the Constitution, to vote for it. And in the very first Federalist paper, he wrote that of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number had begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people. In other words, the greatest number served the people, said they served. Then they commenced as demagogues. They riled up people's emotions rather than their thoughts. And they ended as tyrants. A guy named Samuel Johnson, another well-educated Brit, I guess I'm using a few British quotes, he said, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. He wasn't really criticizing patriotism, but he was criticizing scoundrels who use patriotism. And so there's been a lot of concern about that. And there are many people who feel very uncomfortable, who dislike, who oppose these full-throated thoughts of patriotism, the American creed, and those Puritan, dissenting Protestant cultural inheritances that we have, that affection for the country, the goal to serve in the name of these principles. They don't like it. And especially in our universities, among some of our press, among some of our business leaders in this country, oftentimes they do not like patriotism. It's controversial. Sometimes they view themselves more as internationalist citizens of the world rather than American patriots. They'll look at economic rationality, and they see America less as a unique form of government, a unique cultural heritage, a unique country set apart with with providential guidance, but rather they look at it perhaps as the formation of a global citizenry similar to other nations looking to merge. A lot of people view patriotism as inevitably leading to war. There's an anti-war activist who's been quoted saying, "Patriotism is nationalism and always leads to war." A view of that. Another woman, an anarchist around the turn of the last century, she said, "Conceit, arrogance, and egotism are the essentials of patriotism." Let me illustrate. Patriotism assumes that our globe is divided into little spots, each one surrounded by an iron gate. Those who have had the fortune of being born on some particular spot consider themselves nobler, better, grander, more intelligent than those living beings inhabiting any other spot. It is therefore the duty of everyone living on that chosen spot to fight, kill, and die in the attempt to impose his superiority upon all the others. Not exactly a ringing endorsement of patriotism, I'd say. And this is pretty modern. You have a quote, for example, pretty recently, about 7 or 8 years ago, from the Dixie Chicks. Has anyone ever heard of the singing group, the Dixie Chicks? Okay. You didn't expect a lecture on patriotism to talk about Dixie Chicks, did you now? Well, one of the Dixie Chicks was criticized because she attacked patriotism. She said, "The entire country may disagree with me, but I don't understand the necessity for patriotism. Why do you have to be a patriot? About what? This land is our land? Why? You can like where you live and like your life, but as for loving the whole country, I don't see why people care about patriotism." Recently in South Carolina, one of the high schools said that one of the students who drove his pickup truck to school was not allowed to have a flag on the back of the truck. Created a big controversy. University of California, Irvine, the student council recently voted to remove the flag from the student areas entirely in order to create a more inclusive space. About 13, 14 years ago, have you heard of the city of Boulder, Colorado? I'm sure you've heard of it. Well, the director of the library told a group of employees they were not allowed to hang a large American flag over one of the entryways because it might offend some people. And you see this in our presidential debates. President Obama was asked about American exceptionalism, and he said, "Well, I guess I believe in American exceptionalism, just like the Brits believe in British exceptionalism, or perhaps the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism." He was roundly criticized for being insufficiently patriotic. I just read an article today on Donald Trump, one of the people running for president, who was viewed as a conservative nationalist in his foreign policy. Here's the thing I'll leave you with. I think it's really important to understand who we are and where we've come from as Americans. Because this whole thing about the American creed, this city upon a hill, American exceptionalism, I would argue it's worked out pretty well. It's worked out pretty well when it comes to human dignity, material prosperity, freedom, and individual liberties. I'd say it's worked out well. But at the same time, America has had some dark chapters in our history. Whether it's slavery, discrimination, some wars, and things like that. Some of which have been done in the name of patriotism. And so I think it's important, and this is what I would leave you with, to learn about the American creed. To learn about these Puritan values and the inheritance we've received. To think about affection for our country. To think deeply about service to our country as well. Because ultimately, one of the things about patriotism, about the American creed, about those Puritan values, was individualism, individual thought, equality before all. For example, the Puritans looked at reading the Bible individually and having that personal relationship with God. Just as we today read things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and these other statements, and we think about them for ourselves. We don't just listen to what other people tell us to do. So ultimately, one of the values of patriotism is thinking deeply about this, recognizing that you'll be challenged in your thoughts, as well you should be, and you will have, hopefully, your own views on this, views that comport with our tradition and impel you to serve our country just as former generations have. Thank you very much. Any questions? Well, I'm glad I've answered every single question that you could possibly think of. Am I missing anyone or any questions there? All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Gessler. That was really cool. All right, we have a gift from Mr. Gessler.
I'm giving Mr. Gessler a medallion that says Liberty Common and all the house.
It didn't ring. So, I didn't say you were done yet, so don't get up. So sophomores, remember you're staying in here. This also means that there is no swing dance club today. Don't try and go to swing dance club because there is none.